Hi everyone, welcome to Module 2 of Merchandise Planning and Control. This module will continue the topic of merchandising for profit, which we started in the previous module. In this module, we specifically focus on trend calculations given the 5 components of a P&L skeleton that we learned from the previous module. Then let's first revisit what we learned last class. The key takeaway from last class was the profit equation, what components are actually included in this equation. And we learned those 5 components: net sales, cost of goods sold, gross margin, operating expenses, and operating profit or loss. And we know that net sales minus cost of goods sold equals gross margin. You subtract operating expenses from gross margin, and that leaves us the operating profit or loss. In each of these 5 components can be expressed as a dollar figure, or when it is expressed in percentage, that's percent of net sales, which makes net sales always 100%. In last module, I explained one of the important reasons why we need to keep track of our profit is because profit allows us to evaluate and analyze our performances. Not only the profit, but also the other components of the profit equation, including net sales, cost of goods sold, gross margin, operating expenses, all can also provide some measures of performance. Especially sales and profit in that equation are the 2 most important components probably a lot of the companies are using to evaluate their performance. Sometimes we may look at the same store or comparable store sales and look at the sales from last year and this year and month to month and see how we are improving or not. We may look at the sales per square footage. It's basically per square footage of the selling space, how many dollars of sales are generated. We may evaluate performance based on profits, the profit per transaction of an individual, an average individual consumer, or profit for square footage of the selling space, or profit per payroll dollar that we are getting paid. All these things can be measures of performance. But another good way to see the performance, especially the changes in the performance, is look at the trend. Trend in net sales or trend in profit, or we could even calculate trends for the other 3 components of the profit equation, such as gross margin, operating expenses, and cost of goods sold. Basically, a trend is trying to look at the changes over the years. Trend indicates the percent variation or percent change between 2 consecutive years. So to show how sales or profit or any other figures are trending or changing between the 2 years, we need to use this formula. Basically, you're looking at the numbers. If it is trend in sales, then this year's sales dollar and last year's sales dollar, and you subtract last year's sales from this year's sales, and you divide that by last year's sales, and you turn that into a percentage number by multiplying that by 100. That will give you the trend percent or variation percent or change percent. So these dollar numbers that are used in this formula can be either net sales or profit or gross margin, cost of goods sold, operating expenses, any of those 5 components of the P&L skeleton, depending on what trends you want to read. So if it is a trend in net sales, you're going to have to use all net sales number. If it is trend in profit, you're going to have to use all profit numbers, and etc. So let's take a look at an example problem. Let's say sales this year was $100,000 and sales last year was $92,000. And we want to calculate trend in net sales between last year and this year. Okay, let's pause the video for a second and solve this problem and then resume the video. Okay, so let's take a look at the answer together. Trend equals this year's number dollar minus last year's dollar over last year's dollar. So we apply that formula to these this example. Then this year's sales was $100,000. That minus last year's sales, $92,000. And you divide the answer by last year's sales, which is $92,000, and turn that into a percentage number by multiplying the answer by 100%, and that would be 8.70%. Then what does this 8.7% trend actually mean? That means there is an 8.7% increase or growth in sales in this year as compared to last year. So this percentage number, if the trend is a positive number, that indicates an increase in the number in sales in this case. If it's a negative trend, that means there has been a decrease in sales in case it is trend in sales. Let's work on a couple of review problems utilizing the profit equation from the previous slide. So let's take a look at the first problem, which has a case where net sales are $1 million, COGS is $540,000, operating expenses are $360,000. Let's try to calculate gross margin and profit and loss in both dollar and percent given these three numbers. It's always nice to utilize a grid that shows the skeleton such as this. Let's pause the video while you're working on this problem. Okay, let's confirm the answer together. So let's take a look at the dollars first. Since net sales minus cost of goods sold is gross margin, the gross margin becomes $460,000. Then profit can be calculated by subtracting operating expenses from gross margin. So 460,000 minus 306,000 equals $100,000 of profit. And thankfully the net sales is an even number, $1 million, so it's pretty easy to calculate all the percentage numbers here. COGS would be 54%, gross margin 46%, operating expenses 36%, profit of 10%. Basically you just divide all the dollars of the each component by the net sales dollar. That way you can calculate all the percentage numbers. So in this second problem, as compared to the problem number one, we're leaving everything else exactly the same, except that we're changing net sales from $1 million to $945,000. Let's try to recalculate the gross margin and profit in both dollars and percentage. So you may pause the video for now while you're working on the problem. So let's take a look at the answers. We do use exactly the same ways to calculate things. So net sales minus cost of goods sold equals gross margin. That's how $405,000 gross margin was calculated. And the profit and loss P&L will be $45,000 because profit is gross margin minus operating expenses. And you can also calculate all the percentage numbers by dividing the dollar number of each component by the net sales dollar. And you got all these percentage numbers as you see on the slide. So when you compare the two problems, the problem number one and problem number two here, you can see that although we maintain the same cost of goods sold and operating expenses dollars, because of the decrease in net sales dollar, a lot of the other numbers have changed. In terms of the percentages, if you look at those percentage numbers, the cost of goods sold percent have increased, operating expenses percent have increased, whereas the gross margin and profit percents have decreased. So you can kind of see the reduction of net sales, what impact that has on all the other percentage numbers. But net sales percent stay the same because net sales are always 100%. This slide shows what I just mentioned. And let's assume that the numbers we saw in problem number 2 is this year's number, and problem number 1, those in problem number 1 was last year's number. Assuming this, then let's calculate net sales trend in net sales. So the sales in problem number 2, which is this year, was $945,000. And the sales in last year from problem number 1 was $1 million. In that case, what would be the trend in net sales between the last year and this year? So trend will be calculated by using the formula of this year's dollar minus last year's dollar over last year's dollar. So in this case, this year's dollar will be $945,000 minus last year's sales, $1 million. Divide the answer by last year's sales, $1 million, and time that by 100%, and that would be negative 5.50%. So this means that in this year, net sales decreased by 5.5% from last year's net sales. When you have a negative sign on your trend, so it's in this case negative 5.5%, that means there was a decrease, reduction in net sales. If this were a positive number, that would mean that there was an increase in the net sales between last year and this year. So now let's think about what if we switch those two sales numbers between the 2 years. So now let's say this year's sales were $1 million and last year's sales were $945,000. In that case, what would be the sales trend in net sales? Again, remember the formula for trend calculation, which is this year's dollar minus last year's dollar over last year's dollar. So in this case, this year will be $1 million minus last year's $945,000, and divide that by $945,000, last year's sales, and time that by 100%. And that gives us a trend of 5.82%. So this is a positive number, which means in this year the net sales increased by 5.82% from the last year's net sales. And one thing that we need to note is in the previous slide, the answer was negative 5.50%, whereas here we have positive 5.82%. Remember that it's not exactly just the changing of the sign from negative to positive, but also the number itself has changed from 5.5 to 5.82. That's because the two the formulas used different denominators. Because the denominator of the formula is last year's sales. In this case, we used $945,000 as last year's sales, whereas in the previous slide, the last year's sales was $1 million. So that makes not only the sign, but also the percentage number itself different between the previous problem and this problem. Okay, this concludes module number 2, which was about trend calculation as an extension of the profit and loss skeleton discussion. Please now work on module problem assignment number 2, which will have problems based on this module. Thank you. Bye-bye.